Yeah!
When you think of Michael Jackson, what comes to mind? The king of pop, the untouchable legend, the man who sold over 400 million records, shook the entire planet with Thriller, built the magical world of Neverland, and owned one of the most valuable music catalogs in history. To millions, he was the ultimate symbol of success, talent, and glory. But what if everything you believed was only half the story? Behind the moonwalk, the lights, and the fame lay a heartbreaking reality most people still refuse to face. From the moment he was just an innocent 11-year-old boy, the same powerful record industry that promised to make him a star began to slowly destroy him. Year after year, the betrayals cut deeper, stealing his childhood, burying his music, sabotaging his biggest dreams, and fighting viciously to control everything he built. The emotional scars ran so deep that many believe the entire music business carries responsibility for the pain and trauma he carried until the very end. This is the hidden tragedy of Michael Jackson, a story of ruthless exploitation, devastating betrayal, and one man's lonely war against the machine that created him. You think you already know his story? You have no idea. Hit subscribe. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might just break your heart. Chapter 1. Motown, The Stolen Childhood, 1969 to 1976. Imagine a bitter cold winter night in Gary, Indiana, 1969. The steel mills belched smoke into a black sky, and inside a tiny, overcrowded house on Jackson Street, 11-year-old Michael Joseph Jackson stood barefoot on the worn living room carpet, heart hammering like a drum. His father, Joe Jackson, paced back and forth under the dim light of a single bulb, clutching a crumpled piece of paper like it was a winning lottery ticket. That phone call had changed everything. Berry Gordy, the legendary founder of Motown Records, had heard the Jackson 5's demo and wanted to meet them immediately. No lawyers, no managers, just a simple 7-year contract waiting in Detroit. Joe didn't waste a second. He packed his 5 boys into the family station wagon and drove through the night toward Hitsville, USA, the tiny white house on West Grand Boulevard that had already launched the careers of Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, and The Temptations. When the Jackson family finally stepped inside Studio A the next morning, the air was thick with the scent of cigarette smoke, warm vinyl, and fresh coffee. Berry Gordy sat behind the control room glass, arms folded, his sharp eyes scanning the nervous boys like a predator sizing up prey. He had turned down hundreds of child acts before, but the moment little Michael, skinny, wide-eyed, and barely tall enough to reach the microphone, opened his mouth and sang, the entire room fell silent. Gordy leaned forward, stunned. This child wasn't just singing. He was channeling the soul of James Brown, the smoothness of Smokey Robinson, and something entirely his own. At 11 years old, Michael already had the fire. That very afternoon, without a single independent lawyer in the room, the Jackson 5 signed their fate away on a single sheet of paper. Joe shook Gordy's hand, grinning from ear to ear, convinced he had just rescued his family from a lifetime of factory work and poverty. At first, it truly felt like a fairy tale. Berry Gordy moved the entire Jackson family to Los Angeles and even lived with them for a time in a spacious house on the West Coast. He played baseball with the boys in the backyard on weekends, laughing as Michael tried to imitate his every move. Gordy called Michael the sponge because the boy absorbed everything: dance steps, vocal tricks, stage presence. For a while, he treated the shy, talented child like the son he never had. But beneath the smiles and the backyard barbecues, the machine was already tightening its grip. Motown controlled every single detail of their lives. Every glittery outfit, every precise dance step, every note they sang had to be approved. The brothers were strictly forbidden from writing their own songs. "You're here to perform what we give you," the producers repeatedly told them. Michael, the quietest and most gifted of the group, spent endless hours locked inside the studio, rehearsing until his voice cracked and the soles of his shoes wore through. He practiced the same routine so many times that his feet bled inside those same worn-out loafers. The financial truth was even more devastating. The royalty rate was a shocking 2.7%, split 5 ways among the brothers. After Motown deducted recording costs, studio time, promotion, and endless miscellaneous expenses, the boys were left with roughly 11 cents per album sold in America. To make it worse, Motown held back the majority of the money in a so-called tax deposit account. The only real cash these children ever saw was a weekly allowance of $10 to $20 for the entire group of 5. While I Want You Back, ABC and I'll Be There exploded to #1, making the Jackson 5 the first group in history to have their first 4 singles hit the top of the charts. The boys were still living like they were back in Gary. They traveled in cramped vans, stayed in cheap motels, and ate fast food between shows. Michael later recalled those years as an endless blur of screaming fans, blinding stage lights, and his father's voice barking, "You better not mess this up or we're going right back to the factory." Between 1969 and 1975, the Jackson 5 recorded an astonishing 469 tracks inside Motown studios. Only 174 of them were ever released. The rest were locked away in the vaults, but every single dollar spent recording them was still charged against the boys' future royalties. By 1976, the dream had soured completely. The brothers wanted creative freedom. They wanted fair pay. They wanted to own their own name. Motown refused. When the 7-year contract finally expired, the label dropped its cruelest blow yet. They legally owned the name Jackson 5. If the brothers wanted to leave, they would have to leave that name behind. So in early 1976, they signed with Epic Records and became simply the Jacksons. Jermaine, who had married Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, chose to stay behind at Motown. The rest of the brothers drove away from Hitsville, USA for the last time, hearts heavy, realizing they had spent 7 of the most important years of their lives building an empire that had never truly belonged to them. Michael was only 18 when they left, but the dreamy little boy who once ran around the backyard in Gary, laughing and playing, was already gone forever. In his place stood a young man carrying deep emotional scars, scars left by the very industry that had promised to make all his dreams come true. And as the car disappeared down West Grand Boulevard that final afternoon, Michael stared out the window in silence. He had no idea that the real war, the one with Sony and Tommy Mottola, was still years away. The worst betrayals were only just beginning. Chapter 2, Leaving Motown, The Rise to Superstardom and the ATV Catalog Deal, 1976 to 1995. The engine of the black limousine hummed softly as it pulled away from Hitsville, USA for the very last time. It was early 1976. Michael Jackson, now 18 years old, pressed his forehead against the cool tinted window and watched the White House on West Grand Boulevard grow smaller in the distance. For 7 long years, that house had been both prison and playground. Now the brothers were free, or so they believed. They had signed with Epic Records, a division of CBS that would later become Sony. The new contract felt like fresh air after years underwater. Higher royalties, real creative control, the freedom to write their own music. Michael, who had been quietly composing melodies in his head since he was a child, finally let the floodgates open. In the sleek Los Angeles studios of Epic, the boy who once sang other people's songs began to create his own magic. Late one night in 1979, under the soft glow of dimmed studio lights, Michael stood at the microphone and sang the opening lines of a song that would change everything, "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough." His voice floated through the room like silk and fire at the same time. The producers exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't just another Jackson 5 record. This was Michael Jackson stepping into his own light. The hits poured out one after another. Billie Jean, Beat It, Wanna Be Startin' Something. Michael was no longer performing other people's dreams. He was building his own empire. But nothing could prepare the world for what happened in 1982. November 30th, 1982. Michael stood alone in the control room of Westlake Audio Studio in Los Angeles, listening to the final mix of Thriller. The album was a masterpiece, dark, cinematic, and impossibly catchy. When it dropped, the world lost its mind. Within months, Thriller became the best-selling album in history, eventually moving over 70 million copies worldwide. Michael Jackson wasn't just famous anymore. He was a global phenomenon. On a cool February night in 1984, at the Grammy Awards in Los Angeles, Michael walked onto the stage 8 times. 8. The shy boy from Gary, Indiana, swept the night like a storm. That same year, during the Motown 25 television special, he performed Billie Jean and introduced the world to the moonwalk. The audience screamed so loudly, the sound shook the rafters. For 3.5 minutes, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath as Michael glided backward across the stage like he was walking on air. The next day, every newspaper on Earth carried the same headline: "The King of Pop had arrived." With the money and fame came a different kind of dream. Michael wanted a place where he could finally breathe. In 1988, he bought a sprawling 2,700-acre ranch in the rolling hills of Santa Ynez Valley, California. He named it Neverland, a private wonderland inspired by the story of Peter Pan. There were amusement park rides, a zoo, a movie theater, and a miniature train that circled the property. At night, Michael would sit on the porch of the main house, surrounded by the soft glow of fairy lights, watching deer move silently across the lawns. For the first time in his life, he tried to build the childhood he had never been allowed to have. But even in this private paradise, the pressure never stopped. Joe Jackson, his father, still called constantly, demanding more tours, more money, more control. The industry that had once praised him now watched his every move with hungry eyes. And then, in 1985, came the decision that would quietly plant the seeds of his future heartbreak. One rainy afternoon in New York City, Michael sat across from his lawyer, John Branca, in a quiet conference room overlooking Central Park. On the table lay documents for the ATV music catalog, 251 songs, including nearly every Beatles classic. Paul McCartney himself had warned Michael not to buy it. "It's too expensive," Paul had said with a laugh. "You'll never make your money back." But Michael saw something deeper. These songs weren't just music, they were history. He wanted to own them forever. With Branca's help, Michael made the boldest move of his career. He paid $47.5 million and walked away with the entire catalog. It was called the greatest business deal in music history. Michael celebrated quietly that night at Neverland, playing Beatles records on an old record player while the rain tapped against the windows. He felt powerful, protected. For the first time, he owned something the industry could never take away, or so he thought. 10 years later, in 1995, the landscape had changed. Michael was now a husband and father. The pressure from constant tours, lawsuits, and tabloid storms had worn him down. Sony, the company that now owned Epic, approached him with what seemed like a brilliant partnership. They offered to merge his ATV catalog with their own publishing company. Michael would sell them 50% of ATV for approximately $95 million and create Sony/ATV Music Publishing, a 50-50 joint venture. In the sleek Sony boardroom high above Manhattan, executives smiled and shook his hand. Michael signed the papers believing this was a strategic alliance, a way to protect and grow his legacy. He left the meeting feeling optimistic, imagining a future where he and Sony would build something beautiful together. But as the elevator doors closed behind him and he descended back into the noisy streets of New York, a quiet shadow had already begun to fall. Michael had no way of knowing that the very company he had just partnered with would one day turn against him. The catalog that once felt like armor would slowly become the rope they would try to hang him with. Neverland's fairy lights still twinkled in the California night, but the boy who had once dreamed under those same lights was beginning to realize that even the most magical kingdom could not protect him from the cold calculations of the music business. The golden years were ending, and the real war was about to begin. Chapter 3: Invincible and the Ultimate Betrayal by Sony, 2001. The golden California sun dipped low over Neverland Ranch in the summer of 2001, painting the rolling hills in soft oranges and pinks. Michael Jackson, 43 years old now, stood alone on the wide wooden balcony of the main house, the evening breeze tugging gently at his black jacket. Below him, his 3 young children, 9-year-old Prince, 8-year-old Paris, and 2-year-old Blanket, chased each other across the lawn, their laughter rising like music. For a fleeting moment, Michael smiled. After the painful divorce from Lisa Marie Presley, these quiet evenings at Neverland were the only peace he still had. But inside his chest, a storm was building. He had just finished what he believed would be his greatest comeback, the album Invincible. No expense had been spared. This was the most expensive album ever recorded at the time. Millions poured into the finest studios in Los Angeles, the best musicians, the most cutting-edge production. Michael had worked day and night for years, obsessing over every single detail. This wasn't just an album. It was his declaration to the world: I am still here. I am still the king. His favorite song on the record was Unbreakable. He had an absolutely wild cinematic vision for the music video. Something dark, powerful, almost supernatural. In his mind, he saw himself rising from flames, his body literally regenerating from fire and ash, reborn stronger than ever. It was bold. It was dramatic. It was pure Michael Jackson. He walked into the final meeting at Sony Music's sleek Los Angeles offices, carrying that vision like a torch. Tommy Mottola, the powerful CEO of Sony Music, sat at the head of the long conference table, surrounded by executives in expensive suits. The room was cold, all glass and steel, the kind of place where dreams were either made or quietly buried. Michael laid out his plan. Unbreakable had to be the lead single. The video concept was ready. He had sketches, treatments, everything. But Mottola leaned back in his chair, smiled that polished corporate smile, and shook his head. "We're going with You Rock My World," he said flatly. "Then Butterflies. The Unbreakable video is too expensive, too risky. We're not doing a third video." Michael felt the words hit like a punch to the chest. He argued passionately, his soft voice growing firmer. This was his album. He had poured his soul into it. But Mottola simply repeated the company line: budget cuts, market testing, strategic decisions. The promotion budget was slashed. No major tour was planned. Radio airplay was limited. The album was quietly moved to the back burner while Sony pushed Jennifer Lopez and Destiny's Child instead. Michael left the meeting in stunned silence, his hands trembling as he climbed into the waiting car. He drove back to Neverland that night under a starless sky, the weight of betrayal settling heavy in his stomach. Then came September 11th, 2001. The world changed in a single morning. Michael, heartbroken like millions of others, immediately went into the studio and recorded a charity song called What More Can I Give? He gathered an all-star lineup and poured every ounce of his pain and hope into the track. It was meant to be a healing anthem for a broken nation. He offered it to Sony for immediate release. They killed it. Sony refused to release the song. No explanation, no support. The masters sat on a shelf while the company continued to promote other artists. Michael sat in the dark theater at Neverland that night, watching the news footage of the attacks on loop, tears streaming down his face. He had tried to do something good, something bigger than himself, and once again, the very company that was supposed to champion him had turned its back. The truth, he would later realize, was even colder. Michael's contract with Sony was coming to an end. He was about to become a free agent, one of the most powerful artists in the world with no contractual ties. But he also owned 50% of the massive Sony/ATV catalog, the Beatles songs, and thousands of other priceless copyrights. Tommy Mottola and the Sony executives wanted that catalog. They wanted Michael to sell his half back to them, and they were willing to sabotage Invincible to weaken him, to make him desperate, to force his hand. Back at Neverland, the stress began to eat away at him. Michael grew quieter, more withdrawn. He spent long hours alone in the private theater, watching old movies with his children curled up beside him, but even their laughter couldn't fully chase away the darkness. The man who had once lit up stadiums now found himself retreating deeper behind the tall gates of his own sanctuary, wondering who he could still trust in an industry that had already taken so much. He had given them his childhood with Motown. He had given them his prime with Thriller. Now they were trying to take the one thing he had left, his dignity and his future. Michael Jackson stared out across the moonlit Neverland grounds that night, the fairy lights reflecting in his eyes, and whispered to himself the words that would soon shake the entire music world: enough. The real war was no longer coming. It had already begun. Chapter 4: The Public Protest and the Catalog War, 2002. The summer heat in New York City was brutal that July of 2002. Asphalt shimmered like water under the relentless sun, and the air in Harlem felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Michael Jackson stepped out of a black SUV in front of the National Action Network headquarters on West 145th Street, his fedora pulled low, dark sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too much betrayal. At 43 years old, the man the world still called the King of Pop looked tired, but there was a fire in him that no record executive could extinguish. For months, the wounds from Invincible had festered. Tommy Mottola and Sony had quietly buried his album, killed his charity song after 9/11, and tried to squeeze him until he sold back his half of the Sony/ATV catalog. Michael had finally had enough. He reached out to Reverend Al Sharpton, the fiery civil rights leader who ran the National Action Network. Together, they planned something the music industry would never forget. Inside the packed auditorium that sweltering afternoon, the energy was electric. Hundreds of supporters, local Harlem residents, activists, and fans who had flown in from Europe at their own expense filled every seat and lined the walls. Cameras flashed, microphones waited. Michael stood at the podium beside Sharpton, his voice soft at first, but growing stronger with every word. "Tommy Mottola is mean," he began, the room falling into a stunned hush. "He's a racist, and he is very, very, very devilish." The crowd erupted. Michael paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he delivered the line that would echo across every news outlet in the country. Record companies really do conspire against the artists, especially the black artists. They steal, they cheat. He wasn't reading from notes. This was raw pain pouring out, the same pain that had started in a tiny Motown studio when he was 11 and had never really stopped. Michael held up a large poster that had been prepared for the occasion. On it was a caricature of Tommy Mottola drawn as the devil himself, horns sprouting from his head, a pitchfork in one hand, a sinister grin on his face. The room exploded with applause and shouts of support, but Michael wasn't done. After the speech, he climbed aboard a bright red double-decker bus waiting outside. Hundreds of fans poured into the streets, some chanting, some holding signs. The bus began its slow, deliberate parade around the Sony Music headquarters in Manhattan. Michael stood on the open upper deck, still clutching the devil poster, waving it for the world to see. "Sony kills music," the crowd chanted as the bus circled the towering glass building again and again. Tourists stopped in their tracks. Office workers pressed their faces to windows. News helicopters hovered overhead. Inside the bus, Michael's face was a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. He had flown in quietly, but the moment he stepped onto that upper deck, the shy boy from Gary, Indiana, disappeared. This was Michael Jackson at his most courageous, a man who had once danced for kings and presidents, now using his platform to call out the very system that had made him. The entire music industry was shaken. Mariah Carey, who had been married to Tommy Mottola for years and knew the man better than most, quietly let it be known through friends that she stood with Michael. She never spoke publicly, but her silence spoke volumes. European fans who had spent their savings on last-minute flights stood shoulder to shoulder with Harlem locals, united by their love for the artist and their anger at the industry. Sony's response was swift and cold. A company spokesperson released a statement calling the protest ludicrous, spiteful, and hurtful. They tried to paint Michael as unstable, ungrateful, out of control. But the damage was done. The images of Michael holding up that devil poster on a double-decker bus in the middle of New York City played on every television channel and front page around the globe. Later that same day, standing before the cameras once more, Michael made his position crystal clear. His voice was calm, but resolute. "I only owe Sony one more album, a box set, and then I am a free agent, and I still own half of Sony." The message was unmistakable. He wasn't backing down. He still controlled half of one of the most valuable music catalogs in history, the Beatles songs and thousands more. And he wasn't going to let Mottola or anyone else force him to sell it back under pressure. As the sun began to set over Harlem that evening, Michael climbed back into the SUV. The chants of the crowd still rang in his ears. He leaned his head against the seat and closed his eyes for a long moment. The protest had been exhausting, but for the first time in months, he felt something close to power again. He had taken the fight public. He had named names. He had refused to be silent while the industry tried to bury him. Yet even as the car carried him away from the cheering crowds, Michael knew the war was far from over. The catalog he had fought so hard to own, the one he had outbid Paul McCartney to buy years earlier, was now the very prize Sony wanted more than anything. And they had shown they would stop at nothing to get it. Back at Neverland in the days that followed, the tall iron gates remained closed. Michael spent quiet evenings with Prince, Paris, and Blanket, trying to shield them from the storm swirling outside. But late at night, when the ranch was still and the only sound was the soft hum of the fountain in the garden, he would sit alone and wonder how much more the industry would take before it finally broke him. The boy who had once been controlled by Motown had grown into a man who refused to be controlled by Sony. And in that hot July of 2002, on the streets of Harlem and the sidewalks of Manhattan, Michael Jackson had drawn a line in the sand that the entire music business would never forget. The catalog war had officially begun. Chapter 5, The Long Shadow, The Price of War, and the Stolen Legacy, 2002 to 2009 and beyond. The double-decker bus rolled away from Sony's headquarters in July 2002, but the war it started never really ended. Invincible, the album Michael had poured his heart, soul, and millions of dollars into, was left to die in silence. Sony barely promoted it. No major tour. Radio stations were told to play other artists. The record that was supposed to be his triumphant return became one of the quietest flops in his career. Overnight, the media that once worshipped him turned vicious. Headlines screamed that the king of pop was finished. Sponsors pulled away. The phone stopped ringing. Michael watched his empire of fame slowly crumble around him, and the financial pressure grew heavier with every passing month. Debts mounted, lawsuits piled up. The man who had once sold out stadiums around the globe now felt the walls of Neverland closing in. The catalog war dragged on for years. Michael refused to sell his precious 50% of Sony/ATV. He won the battle in the short term, but the cost was devastating. The constant stress carved deep lines into his face. His health, both physical and mental, began to fracture. He grew even more reclusive, spending long, quiet nights alone in the Neverland theater, watching old films while his 3 children slept nearby. Prince, Paris, and Little Blanket became his only real comfort. Yet even they could not escape the pain of their father's name. Blanket would later be mercilessly bullied at school for that very nickname Michael had given him in love. The boy eventually changed it to Biggie, a quiet, heartbreaking act of survival. In June 2009, the final blow came. Michael lost his father, Joe Jackson, the man who had pushed him onto stages as a child and never stopped demanding more. Just weeks later, on June 25, 2009, Michael himself was gone. After his death, the vultures circled. In 2016, the Michael Jackson estate quietly sold the remaining portion of the Sony/ATV catalog to Sony for $750 million. The company that had once tried to break him finally owned nearly everything he had fought so hard to protect. The Beatles songs, the hundreds of other priceless copyrights, the very catalog Michael had called his children now belonged almost entirely to the same machine that had tried to bury him. The Jackson family, once so close in the face of the world, began to fracture over money and control. Old wounds reopened. Lawsuits between siblings and relatives became public. The man who had spent his life trying to protect his children and his legacy watched from beyond as the very things he loved most were torn apart. Michael had once said, "I have never been silent when it comes to injustice." He spoke up against Motown as a teenager. He stood on a Harlem street at 43 and called out Tommy Mottola by name. He fought the industry with everything he had, but the price was almost too much to bear. Michael Jackson was never just a victim of Motown and Sony. He was a man who dared to stand up and expose an entire industry that had been quietly devouring black artists for decades, from the stolen childhoods at Motown to the cold corporate sabotage at Sony. From the 11-year-old boy whose name and innocence were taken in Detroit, to the grown man holding a devil poster on a New York bus, Michael fought until his last breath. His story is heartbreaking because it is bigger than one man. It is a painful reminder of how the music business can chew up even the greatest talent and spit out the pieces. In the end, the industry won the catalog, but it could never own Michael Jackson's spirit. Now it's your turn to decide, who was the bigger villain? Motown, who stole his childhood, or Sony, who tried to steal his future? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, hit like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next hidden truth about the artists the industry tried to erase. Rest in power, Michael. The king may be gone, but the music and the truth will live forever.